Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at how pilots navigate the skies when they can't see anything outside. We're talking about flying in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, using both analog and digital instruments.
That's right. It's really like having another set of eyes, relying on the feedback from the instruments to give you a sense of what the aircraft is doing.
I always picture those classic cockpits, with all the needles and dials, but nowadays many aircraft have those modern glass cockpits with the digital displays, right?
Yes, exactly. And it's really fascinating how this evolution from analog to digital has really impacted how pilots fly in IMC.
Yeah, it's almost like two different worlds, flying with needles or flying with screens. But before we jump into the digital side of things, let's first try to understand these analog instruments. I'm seeing here that they're categorized by control, performance, and navigation. Why is that?
Well, think of it like this. The instruments are like pieces of a puzzle, each giving you a piece of information about the aircraft's state. The control instruments are all about what you're actively doing with the aircraft, like the attitude indicator showing you the pitch and bank of the aircraft, or the power indicators telling you how much power the engine is producing.
So if I'm understanding correctly, it's kind of like driving a car. The steering wheel and the gas pedal are your control inputs, and the dashboard gauges, like the speedometer and tachometer, are your control instruments.
That's a great analogy. And just like you use those car controls to maneuver and accelerate, a pilot uses the control instruments to maneuver and adjust the aircraft's power during flight.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about those performance instruments? What do those tell the pilot?
Well, performance instruments tell you the outcome of those control inputs. They give you feedback on how the aircraft is actually performing. For example, the airspeed indicator tells you how fast you're going through the air. The altimeter tells you your altitude, and the vertical speed indicator, or VSI, shows you whether you're climbing, descending, or staying level.
Okay, so control instruments are about input, performance instruments are about output. What was the third category again?
Navigation instruments, and these are all about knowing where you are and where you're going, essentially acting as your map and compass in the sky.
Which is super important when you can't see outside.
Absolutely. Navigation instruments like your course indicators and range indicators help pilots follow predetermined routes, while glide slope indicators help them descend safely and accurately during approaches for landing.
Okay, I'm starting to see the whole picture here, but with all these different instruments, how does a pilot actually manage to fly the plane solely by their readings? It seems like a lot to keep track of.
It definitely requires a disciplined approach. Pilots use a four-step process: establish, trim, cross-check, and adjust.
I'm intrigued. What exactly does that entail?
First, you establish the desired attitude and power setting you want for the maneuver. For example, if you want to climb, you'd pitch the nose up to a certain angle and adjust the power accordingly.
Got it. So you set the initial conditions. What's next?
Then comes trimming. You fine-tune the controls so that the aircraft maintains that desired attitude and power setting with minimal input from you. Kind of like setting the cruise control in a car.
Ah, so it's about achieving a stable state for the aircraft.
Exactly. This is super important for smooth, hands-off flight, and it applies to both airplanes and helicopters.
Okay, establish and trim. Sounds pretty straightforward so far. What about the cross-check?
This is where things get really interesting. Cross-checking means constantly scanning your instruments to verify that the aircraft is actually performing as intended. For example, after setting your climb, you'd cross-check your altimeter, VSI, and airspeed indicator to make sure you're climbing at the rate and speed you want.
So it's not just about setting and forgetting, but about actively monitoring how the aircraft is responding. I'm already getting a sense of how crucial this is.
Absolutely. And finally, you make small adjustments as needed based on what you observe during your cross-check. This might involve tweaking the pitch, power, or rudder to fine-tune your flight path. It's a continuous cycle of checking, adjusting, and making sure the aircraft stays on course and performs as expected.
So this four-step process sounds pretty universal. Does it apply to all aspects of controlling the aircraft?
Yes, it does.
Oh.
Whether you're controlling the pitch, the bank, or the power, you're essentially going through that same cycle.
I can imagine that controlling each of those elements would require focusing on different instruments. So how do pilots make sure they're looking at the right instruments at the right time? I'm seeing something here about specific scanning techniques.
Yeah, those are visual patterns pilots use to systematically scan the instruments and avoid fixating on any single one. Some common patterns are the selected radial scan, the inverted V, and the rectangular pattern.
So it's almost like a choreographed dance for the eyes, making sure every instrument gets its moment in the spotlight. But we also have here a mention of something called instrument interpretation. What does that involve?
It's not enough to just read the instrument. You have to understand what it's telling you in the context of your specific aircraft and the maneuver you're performing.
That makes sense. I guess different aircraft might handle differently.
Exactly. Take a climb, for example. The same pitch attitude might result in a very different climb rate, depending on whether you're flying a small airplane or a powerful jet. A 2-bar with pitch up in a small plane might give you a climb of 500 feet per minute. But in a jet, you could be rocketing up at 2,000 feet per minute with the same attitude.
Wow, that's a huge difference. So experience and understanding the nuances of your particular aircraft are key.
Absolutely. Knowing how the instruments interact and how the aircraft responds in various situations is really what makes a skilled instrument pilot.
Okay, so we've kind of navigated through this world of analog instruments. Now let's switch gears and go into the realm of digital instruments or electronic flight displays, those EFDs. Are they just fancier versions of those analog ones, or is there more to it?
They're definitely more than just digital replicas. EFDs represent, I guess you could say, a significant leap in technology. Imagine replacing those numerous dials and gauges with, sleek integrated LCD screens. That's the essence of EFDs.
I can already picture the difference in the cockpit. It must be much less cluttered and easier to visually process information.
Absolutely. The two primary displays,
Hmm.
the primary flight display, PFD, and the multifunction display, MFD, consolidate a vast amount of information in a more organized and intuitive way. The PFD typically presents your essential flight data like attitude, altitude, airspeed, and heading, while the MFD can display navigation information, engine parameters, weather data, and a lot more.
It sounds almost like having a high-tech command center right in front of you.
That's a great way to put it. EFDs provide pilots with a much richer and more comprehensive view of the aircraft state and its surroundings.
But I can't help but wonder, what happens if those digital screens go dark? Is there a backup plan in case of an electrical failure?
That's a crucial consideration, and aircraft manufacturers have designed systems to address that risk. Even in highly advanced glass cockpits, there are typically backup analog instruments for critical parameters like airspeed, altitude, and attitude.
So it's like having a safety net just in case the digital magic fades away.
Exactly. It ensures that pilots can continue flying safely even in the event of a primary system failure.
That's reassuring. So despite all the advantages of EFDs, the core principles of instrument flying we talked about earlier still apply.
Absolutely. The control, performance, and navigation instrument categories are still relevant, even if they're displayed differently. The four-step process, establish, trim, cross-check, and adjust, is just as crucial with EFDs as it is with analog instruments.
Okay, so it's not like EFDs make instrument flying a walk in the park.
Not at all. They offer new ways to visualize and interact with flight data, but the fundamental skills and mental processes involved in flying solely by reference to instruments remain essential.
So EFDs enhance, but don't replace a pilot's skill and judgment.
Precisely. In fact, EFDs often demand an even deeper understanding of aircraft systems and flight dynamics because they provide a more detailed and nuanced picture of what's happening.
That makes sense. You're not just reading a needle, you're interpreting a wealth of data presented in various formats. So, what are some specific ways that EFDs enhance situational awareness and assist pilots in instrument conditions?
Well, one of the key advantages is the ability to display trend vectors. Remember how we talked about the importance of anticipating what the aircraft will do next? Trend vectors are visual cues on the EFD that show you where your airspeed, altitude, or heading will be in a few seconds if you maintain your current trajectory.
That sounds incredibly useful. It's like having a mini forecast for your flight path.
Exactly. Imagine you're climbing to a target altitude. As you approach that altitude, the altitude trend vector on the EFD will start to shrink, visually indicating how much further you need to climb before leveling off.
So instead of reacting after you've already overshot the altitude, you can anticipate and start leveling off smoothly.
Precisely. Trend vectors promote smoother, more proactive control inputs, leading to more precise and comfortable flying. And they're not just limited to altitude. You have trend vectors for airspeed and turn rate as well.
I can see how this would be incredibly valuable in a high workload environment like instrument flying, where timely and precise control inputs are critical. Can you give us some examples of how trend vectors are used for airspeed and turn rate?
Of course. Let's say you're trying to maintain a specific airspeed. The airspeed trend vector will show you if your airspeed is increasing or decreasing and at what rate. So you can adjust your power accordingly to maintain that target airspeed.
So instead of constantly chasing the airspeed needle, you can anticipate those changes and make smoother, more proactive power adjustments. That's really cool.
And for turn rate, the trend vector works similarly. It shows you where your heading will be in a few seconds based on your current rate of turn. This allows you to initiate your rollout from the turn at the precise moment to align with your desired heading.
I'm starting to understand how these trend vectors can significantly reduce pilot workload and make instrument flying more manageable.
They definitely play a major role in enhancing situational awareness. But it's crucial to remember that EFDs are tools, and like any tool, they can be used effectively or ineffectively.
I guess there's always a risk of becoming overly reliant on technology, even with all its benefits.
That's right. Pilots need to guard against complacency and avoid becoming so fixated on the digital displays that they neglect their basic instrument flying skills or lose sight of the bigger picture.
I can imagine a scenario where a pilot gets so focused on a specific trend vector that they miss other important cues or changes in the overall flight situation.
Exactly. And we've seen cases where over-reliance on automation has led to incidents. One example involved a flight that encountered some unexpected weather. The pilots became fixated on following the autopilot's guidance, which was leading them into, well, increasingly dangerous conditions. Because they weren't actively monitoring the overall weather situation and cross-checking the autopilot's actions with their own judgment, they ended up in a pretty precarious situation.
Yeah, that story is a huge reminder that technology, as powerful as it is, should never replace a pilot's own judgment and decision making. It's about finding that balance, between leveraging the benefits of EFDs while also keeping those essential hand flying skills and situational awareness sharp.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The best pilots are the ones who can embrace technology as a tool to make them better, but never give up their responsibility for the safe operation of the aircraft.
As we've been exploring these different worlds, the analog instruments and the digital instruments, it's striking me that there's a kind of a deeper aspect to this beyond just the technology itself.
Yeah, you're hitting on something really interesting. There's a distinct difference in the way pilots kind of interact with the aircraft and interpret information when flying with analog versus digital instruments.
I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Well, with analog instruments, there's a directness, I guess you could say, like a physical connection to the aircraft. You're interpreting the movements of needles and dials and responding to the feedback you feel like through the control yoke. You're constantly in this dance of input and response.
It almost sounds more, I don't know, visceral, more intuitive in a way.
That's a great way to put it. It demands, a deeper understanding of the underlying principles of flight because you're not relying on algorithms or pre-processed data. You're the one making sense of the raw information using your knowledge and judgment to control the aircraft.
I can see how that would foster a stronger sense of airmanship, a deeper connection between the pilot and the machine.
Exactly. And while EFDs do bring a wealth of advantages, like in terms of situational awareness and how the information is presented, some might argue that they can create a layer of abstraction between the pilot and those, well, raw elements of flight.
I guess there's a risk of becoming too reliant on that digital representation of reality, potentially losing some of that tactile feel and intuitive understanding that comes with the analog instruments.
That's a concern that a lot of experienced pilots have raised. It's so important to maintain proficiency in hand flying and analog interpretation, even with all these glass cockpits.
Hmm.
Just like a skilled musician will still practice their scales and techniques, even after they've mastered complex pieces, a pilot should constantly be honing their fundamental skills.
That makes perfect sense. It's about building that strong foundation, and ensuring that you can always fall back on those core skills if and when needed.
Precisely. It's about being a well-rounded pilot, capable of using technology to its full potential, but also respecting those, well, the enduring importance of traditional airmanship and that deep understanding of the art and science of flying.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to how complex and nuanced instrument flying is. It's so much more than just following needles or interpreting digital readouts. It's a fascinating blend of skill, judgment, and constantly adapting to, well, evolving technology.
I couldn't agree more. And as we keep moving toward the future of aviation, it's exciting to think about how technology will continue to shape the pilot's experience.
I wonder what advancements we might see in the cockpits of tomorrow. Will it be even more digital, more automated?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think we'll see automation and integration of systems continue to increase. We might even see virtual reality and augmented reality tech in the cockpits of the future, blurring the lines even more between the digital world and the actual aircraft.
Wow, that sounds incredible. Imagine a heads-up display that projects real-time flight data right onto the windshield, or being able to control systems with voice commands or even hand gestures.
The possibilities are really exciting. But no matter how sophisticated tech gets, the human element, the pilot's judgment and decision-making, will always be the most important.
At the end of the day, it's about that perfect synergy between the human and the machine, leveraging both their strengths to make the skies safer and more efficient.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I hope our listeners are left with a sense of wonder about this incredible world of instrument flying and an appreciation for the pilots who navigate the skies when there's zero visibility.
I think they will. This has been a really enlightening journey, and I want to thank you for taking the time to share your knowledge and insights with us today.
The pleasure was all mine. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning.